Well, good morning, everybody. How are we? Yeah, good, good. It is really good to see you. Like I say every week, if you're a guest, my name is Michael. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's a joy and an honor, as always, to get to be with you as we open up God's Word together and continue our study through the Gospel according to John. And I want to begin this morning with a bit of a story. I grew up playing rec league baseball. Okay. I played a lot of games over the course of my childhood career, but there was one game in particular that I remember better than all of the others. I was in sixth grade. I was out in right field where obviously the most talented players play. I was out in right field. It was the bottom of the ninth. There were two outs. There was a runner on second. The go-ahead run was on second. And the batter steps up to the plate and he hits the ball right to me. And when I say right to me, I mean right to me. And I knew this was my moment. This was it. I knew it. My team knew it. The parents and the coaches, they knew it. And I waved the center fielder off and I put my glove up in the air, yell, "I got it." And the ball goes completely over my head, like just directly back to the gate. The run scores, we lose the game. And I'm sitting out here in the outfield and I'm like, what just happened? I'm completely and totally paralyzed. Now, y'all, I'm a 41-year-old man, and I remember that moment, okay? Why? Well, because failure, right? Like I failed in that moment, and it has just stuck with me because failure it's a powerful thing, isn't it? I mean, how much easier is it for you to remember your list of failures than all of the things that maybe you've done exceedingly well? Like, how quickly do thoughts like, why did I say that? Why did I do that? What was I thinking? How quickly do those thoughts come to your mind versus others? I know for me, failure often like hangs around me like a billboard hanging over my head where it feels like everywhere I go at times that it's saying, hey, this right here, this is who you actually are. And I'm not just talking about bloopers like missing the fly ball, though they often do, but I'm talking about when we failed and it mattered. When we failed and it mattered. When our failures hurt others or when our failures hurt our futures. I'm talking about the ways that we fail consistently over and over and over again that leave us feeling like, am I ever going to grow up? Am I ever going to change? Am I ever going to be different than the way that I am right now? And it seems like that's the thing about failure. It just sticks with us differently than other things we experience. And so if you've ever been there, or if you're here this morning and you are there, I want you to know that our text this morning is for you. Our passage this morning is for you. We're going to be picking up in John chapter 18, starting in verse 15 and working our way through verse 27. And what we're going to find in John 18 is that this is a story about failure. In fact, it's a story about a great failure. But as much as it is a story about failure, it's also a story about who Jesus is and what Jesus does in the midst of our failures. And I think in that regard, we're going to find it incredibly encouraging. And so if you would, let's turn over together to John chapter 18. What we're going to do is we're going to read the whole thing together first, and then we'll work our way back through it. So picking up in John chapter 18, verse 15, this is what it reads. It says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now, the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is this how you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now, Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, You also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once the rooster crowed. Now, there's a lot happening here, but basically, this is taking place on the night that Jesus was betrayed and arrested. And we're kind of picking up right where we left off from a few weeks ago. But essentially, what we have happening here are two things. There are two things happening in this passage at the same time, two simultaneous scenes, so to speak. We have Peter in the courtyard being questioned, and we have Jesus inside being interrogated. Two people put under pressure on the same night. And per usual, John is showing these things to us on purpose. He's juxtaposing these two scenes for a reason. He wants us to see them side by side so that we can do a little comparing and contrasting of how they both respond. And so let's look at them individually. Let's start with the first scene. This is scene one, and the man in the courtyard. Now, obviously, the man in the courtyard is Peter. And let's remember, before this moment, what we actually know about Peter prior to this. When Jesus asked the disciples if they were going to leave him too, it's Peter who steps up and said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. When Jesus went to wash the disciples' feet, Peter pushed back and said, Jesus, I'm not letting you wash my feet. That would be backwards, because he sees Jesus as Lord. When Jesus predicted his betrayal, Peter declared that he would actually lay down his life for Jesus. And just hours before this scene, when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus in the garden, it was Peter who drew his sword and swung it at a man's head. Now, he missed and caught the ear, but the point stands. Peter, over and over again, gives this impression that he is all in. Peter was loud. Peter was loyal. Maybe a little overzealous and bombastic here and there, but at the end of the day, all in. And the most famous example was a bit earlier in the evening when Jesus told Peter that Peter would deny him, and Peter basically said, never. I would never do such a thing. But spoiler alert, he does. What we see in this passage is the most confident disciple in the room is actually the one who falls the hardest. 3 times, in fact, in this passage. Verse 15 shows us the first time. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did the other disciple. The other disciple here is likely John. He loves to refer to himself in the ambiguous third person throughout his narrative. And since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? And he said, I am not. Now, what's really interesting about this first denial here is to look at who asks Peter if he's a disciple. It's a servant girl, a doorkeeper, not a Roman soldier, not a religious official, a young woman whose job was simply to answer the door. It'd be a bit like if a security guard at a concert, let your friend backstage, and then your friend came back out to get you, and then that security guard was like, wait, are you with him now too? The assumption is yeah, we already know you guys are together. But Peter's like, oh, no, not me. I'm not with them. But John has already come in and out of the house to come back to get him. And to boot, in the social world of the first century, this girl has about as little power over Peter as anyone possibly could. Yet at her question, what does Peter do? He collapses. He caves in front of this girl who's just simply standing watch at the door. Peter says, I am not. Which is also interesting because if you've kept up with us in John's gospel thus far, you know that those words carry a certain weight to them. They should hit us in a certain way. All throughout this gospel, Jesus has been declaring his identity in 2 words, ego and me. I am. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. Even earlier in this very chapter, like we looked at a couple of weeks ago, when the soldiers come to arrest him, Jesus steps forward and he says, I am. And they fall down at his feet. But here, Peter says the opposite. Peter says, Uk emi, I am not. And again, we're meant to see the contrast here. Now, we've broken this chapter up over the course of a few weeks, so it could feel very separated to us, but these words are barely 10 sentences apart in the text. The most committed disciple in the room uses the exact opposite words of the Lord he had sworn to die for. And he says it to the doorkeeper for free when nothing was even at stake. But if it only stopped there, Peter's failure goes further in verse 18. Now, the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Now we see Peter comes into the courtyard and he stands by a fire. And this detail matters. If you look back at verse 18, it's cold outside, and the servants and officers of the high priest, the people who had arrested Jesus, are there warming themselves by this same fire. And what's Peter doing? Peter is standing there with them, warming himself amongst Jesus's enemies. He didn't have to be there. He could have left, but he stayed. He stayed in the very spot, surrounded by the very people who were against his Lord. He stayed not out of courage, just out of inertia, out of curiosity, or simply the warmth of the fire. And it's very important that we not forget that these are likely some of the very same people who came out to the garden just a few verses earlier to arrest Jesus. People who were there, who witnessed this overzealous disciple who got trigger happy with the sword. People for whom Peter just a few hours ago was attempting to go toe to toe with. And now he's standing with them, trying to blend in to the scene, so to speak. And if you jump down to verse 25, it says, Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, You also are not one of his disciples, are you? And again, he denied it. And he said, I am not. The same question comes again, and so does the same response. I'm not one of them. I'm not with him. And yet again, it doesn't stop there. Peter's third denial comes in the next verses. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter again denied it. And at once the rooster crowed. So a relative of the very man whose ear Peter had cut off just hours earlier looks at him and says, Didn't I see you there? Weren't you the one who did the thing to my family? Wasn't that you? The very act that Peter thought might have been his boldest moment of loyalty, swinging that sword, becomes something that nearly exposes him. His own past catches up to him in these moments, so to speak. And again, Peter's like, no. For the third time, this isn't me. And then John gives us that detail. And at once, the rooster crowed. Now, at this point, the other gospel writers, Matthew and Luke, say that Peter ran out and wept. They want to make sure that we knew that Peter was well aware of his failure in this moment and was devastated. But John doesn't do that. He just lets the rooster crow, and the silence is meant to be devastating enough for us. This Peter, who had for so many times over and over again said, Oh, I will stand with you, when the pressure actually came, pulled back. He hid. And he said, No. I'm not there. I'm not one of them. I'm actually one of you. Now, here's what I want us to sit with for a minute. Because I don't think the point of this text is to have us hear this and all of us, for some reason, to look down on Peter here. I actually think the point of this text is for us to look at Peter and sort of see his story as a bit of a mirror for our own. Because what Peter's failure exposes here isn't just a moment of cowardice. It is that, to be sure, but it's not just a moment of cowardice. Peter's failure here is really a failure of integrity. It's a failure of integrity. And I don't mean integrity in sense of being morally upright. I mean it in its original sense of the word, integrated, whole. Integrity is being the same person in every room. That who you are in private or behind the scenes is the same person you are in public as well. That those two things go together. And what we see here is that Peter in the garden and Peter in the courtyard are completely unrecognizable from each other. An hour ago, he is swinging his sword for Jesus, but now he's trying to sit back in the shadows and blend in with the very people who arrested him. And the reason that gap exists isn't because Peter was like uniquely weak or uniquely cowardly. It's that his confession never went deep enough to actually hold him when the pressure came. That his confession or his conviction didn't go deep enough to hold him when the heat got turned up. His words, his bravado, it all lacked roots. When the moment arrived for him to really show who he was, there was nothing underneath. And if I'm honest, that gap, that gap between who we claim to be and who we actually are under pressure, that's honestly something that I think about a lot. A lot for me and a lot for us as a people here. Because I think we have to acknowledge something. We're all like Peter in a lot of ways, and there's a very similar pressure upon us as well. I think we have to acknowledge that Lexington, South Carolina is one of the most church saturated places in the country. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it does mean is that around here, it can be kind of culturally normal to wear a veneer of Christianity, right? To wear a little veneer of Christianity, to do things like go to church, to want your kids to be involved in student ministry, to build their character or whatever it may be, to consider yourself a Christian, to use Christian language, to be around Christian people, to have Christian values sort of floating somewhere in the background of your life. And I'm not saying that any of that is bad per se, but what I am saying is that it presents the exact same pressure that Peter feels here to have proximity to Jesus without commitment to him. That in a very real sense, we could have a proximity to Jesus and the things of Jesus that is not the same as steadfast commitment to him. That we could be in this building every Sunday and really still be Peter in the courtyard. Close enough to watch what's happening without ever having to personally identify with it. Warm enough from the fire, but when following Jesus would actually cost you something, we've got nothing. Because here's what we learn from Peter. What we learn from Peter here is that crisis does not create character. Crisis does not create character. Crisis reveals it. Crisis brings out who we really are underneath. And the question kind of becomes like, who are we going to be when the pressure is actually turned up? Peter's failure wasn't random. It was the natural outcome of a gap between his confession and his actual formation. Previously, Peter had said all the right things, but when the moment came, when the pressure was on, when the heat was turned up, his words and his actions had no roots. And so it feels like the appropriate question to me for us is, well, where is that gap for you? Where does that pressure or that tension exist for you? Where is there a distinction between what you claim to believe and how you actually live or who you actually are? For some of us, I think we just got to admit, for some of it's a glaring contradiction, right? Claiming to be a Christian on Sundays, but then living lives full of things like greed and sexual immorality and debauchery the other 6 days of the week. And I'm not naive enough to think that there aren't some of us in here for whom that is true. Behaviors that we know they're unfitting. We know they don't reflect allegiance to the Lord we claim to have faith in. And that is certainly some of us in the room. There is this sharp distinction between what we claim to believe and who we actually are. A severe failure of integrity. But I would guess for most of us, it's not that dramatic. I would guess for most of us, it probably looks a little bit more subtle than that. It looks like a conversation at work or somewhere else where following Jesus would have made things awkward, and we chose to say nothing. It looks like a decision where you knew what was right, but you chose what was comfortable. It looks like keeping your faith private in spaces where it might cost you something. So you choose to stay quiet. You choose to blend in. You choose to warm yourself by the fire that everyone else is warming themselves around. Moments where we should have stood strong and we didn't. Moments where we should have said no and we said yes. Moments where we should have said yes, but we said no. And the point that I'm trying to make to you here is that most denials of Jesus don't happen under persecution. Most denials of Jesus don't happen there. Most denials of Jesus actually happen in the ordinary moments of everyday life, in awkward conversations, under social pressure, in the quiet gap, where this is where we find the quiet gap between what we say we believe and what we actually do. And my guess is that if you have been a Christian longer than 10 minutes, you can probably identify with Peter here. You probably know this feeling. It probably doesn't take much for you or I to consider the ways that we have failed as Jesus' disciples, the ways in which we've warmed ourselves by other fires and had a gap in who we say we are. In fact, John Piper, a pastor that I have tremendous respect for, was once asked, like, what gives you the most doubt? And he said, how slow I am to grow. And when I heard that for the first time, like it hit me like a ton of bricks because I think most of us hear that and it resonates. Like we look at ourselves and we know we've been Christians long enough to know better. We ought to be different by now and we're not. Long enough that that pattern shouldn't exist in us still. And yet here we are again. And it seems to just own us. I'm still so inconsistent with my devotional life. Like I know I say that I believe Jesus holds the world in his hands, but I never talk to him about anything. I still struggle with that same addictive behavior. Yes, I say that I believe that Jesus brings life and peace and hope and freedom, but really, I think it's going to be found in the comfort of this other thing. We still have that same fight where we say that same thing in the same tone to that same person over and over and over again. How slow we are to grow. How quickly we can be to deny the one we claim to believe in. Now, here's where I could stop. I could just cut it all off here, right? And just leave us sitting in Peter's courtyard with Peter, all cold and convicted, feeling pretty beat up and sad, right? About our failures. But thankfully, Peter's failure is not the only thing happening in this passage. There's another scene taking place right in front of the man in the courtyard, and it's the man in chains. Let's pick up in verse 19. It says, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So while Peter's in the courtyard, absolutely falling apart, Jesus is in the inside with a pressure of his own. Jesus is on the inside, being questioned and interrogated in a very similar way to Peter as well. Annas is questioning him, and for what it's worth, this is a powerful man, a former high priest, and the real power behind his son-in-law, Caiaphas, a man who had already decided the verdict before the actual trial began. And for what it's worth, what we have happening here is a real kangaroo court situation. This is a proceeding under the cover of night with no real legal standing, designed to produce one single and solitary outcome. And yet Jesus, who is in chains, who knows he's already been betrayed, who's been arrested, who knows exactly where this night is going, is completely composed. And notice his response. He says, I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple. I've said nothing in secret. Ask those who heard me. They know what I said. For what it's worth, that's not defiance. That's actually something better. In fact, we're meant to see it in contrast to Peter's denial. Whereas Peter denied, as where Peter hid, Jesus is operating with total transparency. Jesus is being completely exposed here. And he's saying, I have nothing to hide. I have been the same person in every room, every moment, every crowd that I have ever been in. Ask anyone. Ask anyone. The public record for me is actually the private record. I am the same person there that I have been here. When the officer slaps him across the face, the first physical violence against Jesus in John's account, Jesus doesn't flinch. He doesn't rage. He simply says, if I said something wrong, tell me what it was. But if I said something right, why are you hitting me? Here is a man who is in complete command of himself, not because his circumstances are good, but because his identity and his integrity are secure. Jesus knows exactly who he is, and he knows exactly what he came to do. And no amount of pressure is changing any of that for him. No amount of pressure is causing him to compromise or shift or shape his conviction. Whereas Peter's faithfulness is shaped and shifts based on his circumstances, what we're meant to see here is that Jesus's are not. Peter says, I am not. And Jesus, even in chains, is still saying, I am. And the point is, while Peter is faithless, Jesus is simultaneously faithful. While Peter is failing over and over and over again, Jesus is not. And here's why it's so important that you not miss that contrast, because honestly, it's the whole gospel in a miniature form. In a very subtle way, we're getting the story of the gospel here. The gospel tells us that Jesus lived a life free of sin that we did not live, and he died the death for sin that we deserved to give us new life. And that's what's happening here in short. Jesus does what Peter failed to do. For all the ways that Peter did not do as he was meant to do, did not live up to what he was supposed to live up to, Jesus did. Where Peter failed, Jesus succeeds. Peter's denial, and for what it's worth, Peter's denial didn't catch Jesus off guard. We know this. Jesus predicted it would happen. He knew Peter would be standing by that fire, and he let it happen because he is in that room, in those chains, being interrogated for Peter. For Peter and for people just like Peter who deny Jesus in just the same ways. And this is really the scandalous logic of the cross. This is really the scandalous logic of the gospel. The one person in this story who had every right to deny Peter, who would have been completely justified in saying, I'm not for him, I don't know him, was the one in chains, and he never did. Jesus, standing before the highest religious authority in Jerusalem, beaten and bound, he never hid who he was or who his people were. He never hid what he came to do. He claimed them all, even the one warming himself by the wrong fire. You see that? Jesus is here even for the one who denies him. And that actually brings me to the final detail that I want us to see this morning. So back in verse 18, John makes a point of telling us the type of fire that Peter is warming himself by. He doesn't just call it a fire, but he calls it a charcoal fire. In the Greek, it's actually one word, anthrakia, okay? And John rarely gives us insignificant details. If you've learned anything from this series through John, it's that John is very intentional with the details he includes, and this is one of them. That word, anthrakia, appears exactly twice in the entire Gospel of John. Here in chapter 18, and in one more very important place, chapter 21. Flip over there for a moment if you can. I want you to see the scene where this takes place. So in chapter 21, it takes place right after the resurrection. So this word comes up again after Peter has failed 3 times, after the cross, and after the empty tomb. And in chapter 21, Jesus appears on the shore of Galilee. And it's worth noting that this is not a nearby location to Jerusalem where all these other events took place. It's some 90 miles from Jerusalem, a 5-day walk. And in John 21, what we find is that Peter has gone back home. He's gone back to Galilee, to where he was at before he met Jesus. He's actually on fishing like he was before he met Jesus. And what we see here is that that space between Jerusalem and Galilee, well, Jesus covers that distance. And in verse 9, it tells us that when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. So the disciples see Jesus from the shore, from their boat on the shore. They come to him. And when they get there, they see that Jesus has made a charcoal fire, anthrakia. And after breakfast, the text goes on to say that Jesus, around this charcoal fire, turns to Peter, the one who denied him 3 times, and he asks him 3 times, Simon, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? 3 questions to undo 3 denials. The same number over the same kind of fire. And John is not doing that on accident. John is telling us that when he wrote the details of this courtyard scene, he already knew how it ended. He already had chapter 21 in mind. The charcoal fire of Peter's failure becomes the charcoal fire of Peter's restoration. Jesus didn't put out the fire, he built a new one, and he invites Peter back to it. And for what it's worth, we have no idea what Peter is thinking or feeling in these moments, but I can tell you that as a person who has failed, I feel confident that the unpleasant reminder of what happened had to come flooding back into his mind. As Jesus recreates this scene, I can only imagine that Peter is reliving these moments and all the insecurity and guilt that comes along with them. But the point is that even as it does, Jesus looks this failure of a man in the eye. The man who hid when the heat was turned up, the man who may be feeling all sorts of insecurities and insufficiencies, perhaps even thoughts of whether or not God could ever or would ever use him again. And what happens is we find that Jesus covers the distance, recreates the scene, looks him in the eye to tell him, Peter, if I'm not dead, then when it comes to you, I'm not done. That if I'm not dead, when it comes to you, I'm not done. Now, I don't want you to miss it. Jesus is not offering Peter a second chance here. He's not saying, okay, Peter, we're going to redo this thing, but if you fail again, then we're really through this time. Then it's over and done. That's not it. He's not giving Peter a second chance. He's giving Peter a promise. What he's exposing to Peter in this moment is that, Peter, your failures, for however grand they may seem to you, they are not the deciding factor here. They are not the deciding factor for your life. They're not the deciding factor for your future. You want to know the deciding factor? Peter, it's me. Who I am and what I've done. I am what decides what is going to happen with your life. And for what it's worth, that is such wildly good news for you and for me. Because I don't know about you, but I'm going to need more than a second chance, right? A second chance isn't going to cut it for me. I'm going to need a third and a fourth and a fifth over and over again. I don't need second chances. What I need is promises, because second chances run out, but a promise never does. A promise never runs out. And the good news of the God we serve is that he is a God of promises, not second chances. He is a God who has finished the work on our behalf to give us new life, to give us every chance we could ever need. When Jesus reinstates Peter, he is filling the gap, giving a new story, saying it doesn't matter how far apart we may be. It doesn't matter how far gone you may feel you are. I am still coming for you. The God who built a breakfast fire on the beach for the man who denied him 3 times, he isn't keeping score. He's giving grace. And it is not over until he says it's over. And so, church, I often tell you that the Bible is not about you, okay? And it's not. The Bible is not a story about you, it's a story about Jesus, all right? And we need to read it through that lens. But this morning, this is one of those mornings where I would like to invite you to just put yourself smack dab in the middle of this story, okay? Because every single one of us, in ways big or small, is a failure like Peter. And every single one of us needs a faithful Savior like Jesus. And maybe you've walked in here today and that failure or that billboard that kind of hangs over your life is about something recent, a conversation you ducked, a moment where you knew what faithfulness looked like and you chose the path of least resistance. Maybe you've been in the building and known all the right things, but if you're honest, you would say there's a gap between what you say and what you actually live. Maybe you're here this morning and you recognize you've been warming yourself around the wrong fire. Listen, if that's you, the invitation is not to feel worse about it. It's to move. It's to leave the wrong fire behind, to let the distance between who you are and who you're called to be become the very thing that Jesus closes for you. It's to repent of whatever the sin may be and put the full weight of your life and faith onto Him, onto the one who is faithful on your behalf. And maybe for you, the billboard isn't about something recent. Maybe it's about something that has been in your life for a long time. Maybe it's the thing you did years ago, a skeleton in your closet, a past that haunts you, a pattern that won't just quit, a version of yourself that you can't seem to get past. And the longer it's been there, the more it stopped feeling like a memory and it started to feel like a verdict. To you, I want you to hear me say clearly the rooster has crowed, the story is over, and Jesus has already made the fire on the beach. And if Jesus isn't dead, then when it comes to you, He's also not done. He's also not done. Listen, I don't know how far you've run, but what I do know is that Jesus covers the distance. I don't know what your failure is, but what I do know is that His grace is sufficient for it, for both your past, your present, and your future. I don't know if you've walked in here this morning with the smell of the wrong fire all over your clothing, but what I do know is that through His life, death, and resurrection, Jesus has built a new one for you to come and be around. And this same Jesus who stood unshaken in the courtyard, the same person in chains, this Jesus is for you. Not because of how well you followed Him, but because faithful is simply who He is. And what keeps you secure is not your unfailing faithfulness to Him, but to His unfailing faithfulness to you. All we have to do is receive it. Let's pray.